Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Duke, and welcome to another installment, our final installment of Shakespeare 400, Death, Remembrance, and Resurrection, as we commemorate, for the last time in anybody's lifetime, the anniversary of Shakespeare's death. 400 years ago today, this year, the Bard died, and since then, the accolades haven't stopped, the influence hasn't stopped. And so we picked death as a wonderful way to memorialize the man in the year that he died and the anniversary of the year that he died. And so in this final segment, it makes me a little sad to think about it, we're going to look at the some final ramifications of death in Shakespeare and his plays, and we're going to conclude with something a little bit different. Shakespeare, at the end of his career, the last 4 plays he wrote, as far as we can tell, were a radically different kind of play. They were called romances. They're in some ways modern precursors of the traditional fairy tale, the modern fairy tale as we understand it. And in them, it's as if Shakespeare got very tired of all the death and the great tragedies. On the heels of Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, King Lear, Timon of Athens, Antony and Cleopatra, those great tragic plays that ended with so much death, it's almost like the end of his career, Shakespeare decided before he retired he couldn't go out that way. So in the final 4 plays, Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest, he creates a play that almost starts in death but moves quickly beyond it to images of resurrection and forgiveness and reunification. And by the end of the hour today, we'll get to that. But moving forward, there are a few other aspects of the culture. We spent a lot of time in the last 2 segments talking about the power or the impact of disease, the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, various other diseases as well, on mortality, and how these images of death and decay through disease predominate his plays. But there are a couple other things as we wrap up I'd like to point out. Beyond the idea of the mortality rates from plagues, influenza, the pox, syphilis, and of course the plague, the bubonic plague. Beyond those influences, you had a number of other aspects of the culture that made death very prominent. And so in 1543, you have the first great modern anatomical textbook that was written by a fellow by the name of Andreas Vesalius of Brussels. The title of the work is the Fabrica, or the Decorporis Fabrica Humana, on the fabric of the human body. And this Fabrica, huge folio volume, had really cutting-edge anatomical descriptions and anatomical illustrations that were based on actual observation of dissected bodies. It is a little odd for us to recall now that for about the first 3,000 years of Western culture, the idea that you would dissect human bodies was largely forbidden. In fact, no place before the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, can we really point to a time where individuals in the Greek world or the Roman world, certainly the early medieval world, were not permitted to dissect bodies for cultural and religious reasons. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, very limited dissections were allowed in the name of verifying what ancient authority had said. However, by the 16th century, the early 16th century, there was an explosion in bodies being dissected. And this ties in with a second related point. Not only did you have, for the first time in Western culture, human bodies being dissected, they were dissected publicly. So these bodies were always the bodies of executed criminals. The only people who really were allowed to be dissected were felons who were executed by the state. In England, when they hanged somebody for a particularly heinous felony, oftentimes, not always, but sometimes the bodies would be turned over to the Barber Surgeons' Hall, to the Guild of Physicians and Surgeons, so that they could begin the process of dissecting bodies. And when they did dissect bodies in places like London, very often they did it publicly. People could come and watch. And so imagine how we all know from middle school and high school biology, we have a pretty good sense of what's inside our bodies. But in the 16th century, they didn't. And the idea that you would put that on display in a very public way created all sorts of somatic or bodily fears and traumas. And if you can see here, this is a great illustration from Vesalius's De Humanae Corporis Fabrica, a picture of the human skeleton. And as you can see, really interesting, they were just beginning to dissect bodies then in earnest. And when you took a body and you broke it down to its constituent parts, you pulled it to pieces, you were left with a skeleton. You had to sort of boil the bones to get the sinews, the tendons off of them, and then you put a skeleton back together. This was really the first time in human culture that anybody had done this. So the word for it is, it's kind of a beautiful word actually. To put a skeleton back together this way, is called articulating it. And that's a lovely word in the sense that you are articulating the skeleton, you are putting its pieces back together, but you're also, in a way, allowing it to speak. The skeleton itself becomes articulate about the nature of not just the physical realities of the human body, anatomy, but also the metaphysical. All the great anatomists of the 16th century, when we have this really blowing up of anatomical research, they almost always couch their anatomical illustrations in very philosophical memento mori poses. So here, in the Fabrica of 1543, you have a very articulated human skeleton. Note a couple of things. There's no way, really, without radiography, without radiation, X-rays, that you can tell that a human spine is curved. We know, right, that a human spine has a distinct curvature to it. But if you were only going upon bones that you had boiled the flesh off of, you would not necessarily, in putting the skeleton back together, recall or be able to recognize that there was a slant there, a curve. And as you can see in the illustration, the spine on the skeleton is almost razor straight, which couldn't be the case. Notice the exaggerated size of the rib cage. But also notice, if you can, all around the skull and the bones, there are all sorts of little letters. Those letters on the various bones correspond to a glossary or an index in the book, where a student could look at the letter or the symbol on the skull, on the shoulder, on the thigh bone, and then look at some actual text that Vesalius had written about the dissection and the articulation of that bone. And so this is one of the very first times anywhere in the world, particularly in Western culture, where you had this idea that you could have an illustration, and that illustration then could be marked in such a way that it could be used to refer back to the text. I mean, this is something we take for granted every day, but prior to the 16th century, it was not an obvious thing. And also, if you look at the picture, not only is it an attempt on the part of the anatomist to be as anatomically correct in rendering the human skeleton as possible, it is also a memento mori, that you could not escape the philosophical ramifications. Anatomy is a science. Anatomy, which is the foundation of modern medicine, right? If you don't know what's in a body, if you don't know what's in a body, whether it's organs, muscles, sinews, tissues, bones, if you don't know how they work, it's going to be awfully hard for you to base modern medicine on the proper functioning of the body. So this was an absolutely critical step to the modern professionalization of medicine. And yet, notice what they've done. They've couched these radical anatomical illustrations in very philosophical poses. As you know from our earlier segments, the memento mori, the remember to die tradition, that all of the science here, and it was radical cutting edge science for the day, these pictures, they are subordinated, they take second place to the larger philosophical implications of the picture. And so there you have a skeleton philosophically brooding over a skull. 60 years before Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, you have a kind of Hamlet graveyard scene, don't you? You have the fully articulated human skeleton with the very philosophical, almost Rodin's sculpture, the thinker, right? This almost philosophical, thinkerish pose reflecting over a skull, right? We see how fancifully elongated the arm is, by the way. Look at how long the skeletal arm is. That would drape down to its knees, much more simian, ape-like than human. And yet here you are in a graveyard, a scene of remembrance, just like Hamlet's graveyard scene. You have a philosopher, a Hamlet, a skeletal Hamlet, philosophizing over a skull of Yorick in a pose that's guaranteed to suggest the vanity of human life. How fleeting is this human existence? So again, 60 years before Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. And by the way, before they had dramatic theaters, before there was a Globe Theatre or a Swan Theatre in London in the 1590s showing plays, they actually had anatomical theaters. So in the early 16th century, there were no play theaters, but you could go to an anatomical theater in places like Padua in Italy, and you could file into these theaters, and you could watch a dissection. Same thing in that more or less they had a movable one, a collapsible one at Barbers Surgeons Hall in London. By the way, Barbers Surgeons Hall was on Monkwell Street in the southern part of London. And literally a few blocks, about 1 block away from that is Silver Street, Silver and Monkwell. Shakespeare lived for a long time during the height of his career on Silver Street, which was just a few doors down from Barbers Surgeons Hall. So Shakespeare's most immediate neighbor for a long time, he was working in London, was a few doors later, Barbers Surgeons Hall, a few doors down the road, where these kind of dissections were taking place with some routineness, regularly every year. So when you think about all of the imagery of death and decay and bones, graveyards and cemeteries and body parts that just predominate Shakespeare's plays, remember, Before they had a dramatic theater in London, they had an anatomical theater where you could watch as if it was like a play. In some of the Italian theaters, for instance, girls would be selling oranges at these anatomical theaters. You'd have people hawking goods while they watched the dissection. At one particular place, they used to have the skeleton of the body of the human being that was going to be dissected, I should say, beneath the stage. And they would mechanically raise the body up to the stage as if it were a performance. And so in London, they had similar things. And so here you have this very philosophical image. And all of the, I pointed out already, all of the markings on the skeleton, which could be linked directly to anatomical explanations. Things that Vesalius, the dissector, had actually noticed in human bodies. His research tied to the actual illustrations. But all of that is subordinated to the philosophy. And written here, among other places on the image, you have this particular philosophical mind, this philosophical moral that's there in quotes. All splendor is dissolved by death, and through the snow-white limbs steals Stygian hue to spoil the grace of form. Genius lives on, all else is mortal. What a wonderful theme of vanitas, the Memento Mori. No matter how beautiful the body, no matter how perfect the limbs, death, Stygians, from the river Styx, right? The black waters of the river Styx, the poisoned waters of death. No matter how beautiful, how pristine the body is, sooner or later, right? This Stygian hue, death creeps through the snow-white limbs to spoil the grace of form. Bodies revert to the dust out of which they were made. And that wonderful Memento Mori, genius lives on. All else is mortal. Everything else dies. And what a great epithet. That may be the greatest epithet for Shakespeare, too, if you stop and think about it. His body has long since been consigned to clay, 400 years ago, and yet still the genius lives on. A picture here, an important picture of John Bannister's, an English doctor living in London, 1580. This is a picture he had commissioned of a dissection scene. Shakespeare would have been 1564. He'd have been 16 years old in 1580. And so it's conceivable. Now, he didn't live in London at the time, as far as we know. But certainly these kinds of procedures were taking place in London even at an early time. And you can see the corpse laid out there on the table. You can see the doctor. They've opened the abdomen of the body, and that was interesting. We don't perform dissections that way today. They had to, because they didn't have refrigeration. So you couldn't just leave bodies for long periods of time because the corruption and the smell would become overwhelming. So they started their dissections with the abdomen. That's where most of the water, the liquid, is in the body. And that's where most of the corruption happens quickest, where the smells come from. So they begin there. They take out the viscera, the abdominal organs and tissues. Then they moved up to the chest cavity, then the head, the brain. And finally, after the fourth day, it's about all you could go with a corpse like this before it became overwhelming. The fourth day, they would examine the extremities, which were more or less just muscle and sinew, much less quick to decay. And so you can see it's a public dissection. So crowds of Elizabethans in their starched collars are gazing on the spectacle. You can imagine what kind of trauma, what kind of somatic crisis this triggered in Elizabethan England when bodies were on display. Bodies that historically would be buried, prayed over, washed, buried, prayed over, put in consecrated cemeteries where they would rest until the last day. We saw in Hamlet how one of the creepiest aspects of Hamlet is how dead things don't stay buried. Bodies put in the ground like Yorks get dug up again to make way for new bodies, charnel houses. What an added dimension of metaphysical terror this provided. And if you go to the next one, this is an actual picture of John Bannister, his medical cabinet, his tools. You can see there the dissection table. You can see all the instruments. These are not the scalpels and the forceps we know today. These are really heavy, almost gardening grade, wood cutting grade tools. You've got saws and you've got all sorts of clamps, big butcher type knives and sharp razors. This is what they used to go after those bodies and to take them to pieces. And the other thing that they recognized in the 16th century is that dissecting a dead human body was a huge step forward for medicine. But they also knew that in dissecting a dead body, that there was much about living bodies that you couldn't learn. One of the things they did is after the dissection of a dead human body, they would vivisect live animals. And you can see here a dog, or a pig, in this case it's a pig, that has been strapped down to the table. He's been opened up while still alive, so they could study the interior to see what happens in death, to see the processes of the body. Up on the upper right-hand corner there, that's a dog that suffered a similar fate, and you have a monkey on the left. Monkeys were considered the animals most close to human anatomy and structure. And so monkeys were routinely dissected as a way of vivisected, as a way of trying to understand what happens to the living body over the course, how the processes worked. Grisly, unfortunate, inhumane, you might even say. But without it, we wouldn't have modern medicine. And to give you a sense of the Memento Mori, I thought that I'd throw this in here. Recently, within the last half decade or so, we've discovered in an archaeological dig in Mantua, Italy. Why Mantua? What's interesting about Mantua? Well, Romeo and Juliet, right? In what is now Mantua, Italy, they discovered 6,000-year-old skeletons buried together. You can see the actual bones on the left, and then on the right there is a clarified reproduction of what they're doing. And they're called the Lovers of Valdaro. And so you have this beautiful Memento Mori here that was unearthed from 6,000 years ago, very recently in Italy, in the general vicinity of where Romeo and Juliet took place. And these ancient skeletons evidently posed, archaeologists have decided that they were posed this way after death. There is no sign that either body was murdered. There's no immediate signs of trauma. And you can see there on by the thigh here on the picture on the left, you can see a blade. There were some utensils and tools that were buried with them. And if you look at the reproduction on the right, you have this kind of embracement even in the tomb. Which is kind of an interesting concept from the Memento Mori. And then I wanted to throw this in. I was teaching a subject very similar to this. I was teaching a class on Shakespeare in the 1990s in Tennessee, at the University of Tennessee, and going through some of these images of plague, images of dissection, corporal punishment. And we mentioned that the only bodies that were dissected in the Elizabethan anatomical theaters were the bodies of executed criminals. And so these public dissections were preceded by public executions. Notorious felons were executed publicly. In the same way that the Elizabethan populace would turn out to watch a dissection, they would also turn out to watch a hanging. And hanging was the preferred method. Cutting the head off somebody or poisoning them or drowning them problematized the dissection. Hanging them was perhaps the cleanest way to get the body into the hands of the anatomist with little fuss. But when I was talking about this to a group of kids in Tennessee in the late 1990s, one student came up to me after class one day, and her grandmother had just died. And they were going through grandma's things up in the attic, and she found this right when we were talking about the Memento Mori. It's a picture from the late 19th, perhaps earliest 20th, anywhere from about 1890 to 1910 or so. And it's an actual photograph of young doctors practicing a dissection as part of their education and learning how to become medical men, doctors. And you can see them standing around in their finery, and there's a corpse, there's a body on the table that's been pretty much stripped down to nothing. Bottom left-hand corner, you have another fellow with a saw about to cut the skull off the top of a torso that's been severed in half. And pretty grisly, but then again, when you think about 1890 to 1910, it's the best these doctors had to begin to let them understand how the body functioned as a way of trying to save living people. And interesting enough, Grandma had written on the bottom of the paper there, the bottom of the picture, she saved it all her life, she wrote a reminder of what faces us, of what mortality is. And so even there, it was interesting, great way to tie it all together for that class. And so, taken the barber surgeons, the place of dissection in Shakespeare's day in London, again, when he was at the height of his career living in London on Silver and Monkwell Street, just his near next door neighbor were the College of Surgeons, the College of the Barber Surgeons. Barbers and surgeons were the same guild. Barbers in Shakespeare's day did more than cut hair. In fact, cutting hair was almost something they didn't do much of. Pulling teeth, drawing blood. Barbers were sort of medical practitioners in the same, not quite as exalted or educated as surgeons, but they shared the same guild. And they had a whole big diary about what happened. And so we get some really insight into how psychologically disturbing public executions and dissections were, and how they also impacted dramatically Shakespeare's world. The civic governors, the people in charge of getting bodies off the gibbet where they had been hanged, and giving them to the barber surgeons were the beadles. These were church officers. They were elected church officers whose job it was to do things like this. The beadles were the one who had to sent to the doctors, sent to the hanging. As soon as the hanging was over, the beadle would have to claim the corpse, right? And then put it in a carriage and carry it to the surgeons. That didn't always go as planned. Here's a direct quote from the annals of the Sidney Young's Annals of the College of Barber Surgeons. Quote, "The practice was for the beadles to attend at the gallows and select bodies as they pleased for the surgeons. Their opponents, the people who opposed them, were generally the hangman, who himself trafficked in those uncanny goods, and the relatives of the criminal, the populace at large, who were also incited by the relatives to resist the beadles. Many unseemly fights took place over these bodies. And oftentimes when the beadles had secured a subject, a body, and were driving off with it in a coach, they were attacked and beaten, and the body rescued from them. The hangman appears to have been entitled to the dead man's clothes. So whoever the hangman hanged, he was entitled to the clothes. For on more than one occasion, the company gave compensation for them, for the clothes had been torn to pieces in the brutal struggle between the family and the citizens and the beadles for who had possession of that body." I mean, you can imagine this, right? A grieved family. They actually saw it, the Elizabethans, as an added punishment, capital punishment beyond death. Not only are you taking the life of a malefactor, of a felonious sinner, a criminal, but you are subjecting that body then to the metaphysical terrors of deconstruction. Remember we said earlier on that in a culture that believed that bodies would have to get up at the last day, they'd have to piece themselves together, they would have to get up from their grave to be reunited with their souls. The idea that you're going to take a body and pull it to pieces, shred it down to nothing, in the name of science and philosophy, well, that was very, very disturbing to them. And so you have these fights over the body. And then you get situations like this. This is absolutely staggering. 1587. 20 February 1587. Remember, we don't know where Shakespeare was between 1585 and 1592 when he began his career. But this is an event that made all the chronicles. This was a big deal. 20 February 1587. A strange thing happened to a man hanged for felony at St. Thomas Waterings. After the body being begged by the surgeons of London to make an anatomy of him, and after he was dead to all man's thinking, he was cut down from the gallows, stripped of his clothing, laid naked in a chest, thrown into a car, and so brought from the place of execution to the surgeon's hall. His chest being there opened, and the weather extremely cold, he was found to be alive. And he lived 3 more days until 23 February. So they cut open the chest and they found the heart still beating. The cold weather had done something. And then he died. And as a consequence of this was a horrifying thing. He wasn't dead. The hanging didn't kill him. It was the anatomy that did. And they assumed that he had died. And so a few months later, 13 July 1587, the barber surgeons passed a rule. And here's what the actual 16th century rule was. Quote, "It is agreed that if any body shall at any time hereafter happen to be brought to our hall for the intent to be wrought upon by the anatomists, it shall receive or come to life again, as late has been seen. The charges for that, the fee shall be borne, levied, and sustained by such person or persons who shall happen to bring home the body." In other words, whoever brings the body in, if it's not dead, he's going to have to pay for it. Pay for its maintenance until it dies, because in the 16th century, once you open the chest, you couldn't just close it again. You were going to die. And further, shall abide the person who brings the corpse, that's not really a corpse, shall abide the fine that this house shall award. I mean, think about the horror of this. This is something that stories like this just were all rampant across London. And why the body emphasis? All these other ways to think about death in the period. And that takes us to Macbeth. You get just like the grisly scenes that we imagine. Think about Alas Poor Yorick, and think about that skeleton, that anatomically correct skeleton in the graveyard focusing on the skull of Yorick. And then you get a play like Macbeth, right? When Macbeth's wife dies in Act 5, and both of them have so given their souls over to evil, they have sacrificed what Macbeth calls the immortal jewel that is his soul to their rank ambition. They murder the rightful king to take power. And when Lady Macbeth dies, you get this beautiful, chilling, haunting reflection like everything we've seen so far. In his weariness of blood, Macbeth says, she should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word of sorrow. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day until the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And you see this aspect of death in the culture. To the sinful man, to the felon whose body might the very next day be on the anatomist's table, to those who have despaired, to those who have turned their back on God, life becomes a harrowing thing. This wife of mine, she should have died later. Macbeth says, perhaps I could have summoned up some sympathy. What is life to somebody in Macbeth's position, without hope, without faith? Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from one day to the next. And what have all our yesterdays taught anybody? They've simply lighted fools the way to death. And this is that beautiful image where Macbeth compares a human life to a candle. Remember back in segment 1 when we showed you time and death, arm in arm, the skeleton and the old man. And they were snuffing out a candle, the flame of a candle. This is exactly what that is. Imagine that image, 16th century image, now turned to words. What is a human life? Out, brief candle. Life is nothing but a walking shadow. Life, the beautiful metaphor, the analogy to the actor. Life is a poor actor who struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. He's like some bit player who's not even in the program, who for a brief period of time, as an extra, as an accessory, struts across the stage a couple times and then he's gone. Life in this regard is a tale told by an idiot. It is full of sound and fury, but what does it mean? To the hopeless, to the despairing, to the desperate. And by the way, Faulkner's great novel, The Sound and the Fury, is taken from this quote exactly. But we've already mentioned, besides disease and besides public executions, this idea of the anatomy. Human dissection in Shakespeare's day was actually called performing an anatomy. It was performing an anatomy when you cut in and dissected the body. And so this is not surprisingly, this is the era, the 16th century, because of the medical technology of dissection. The word anatomy enters the English language not just as the parts of the body, not just as the process of dissecting a body. An anatomy now, the word anatomy, comes to mean any kind of satirical exposure of corruption. It became, in other words, a philosophical word, not just a medical word. And numerous books in the 16th and 17th century are written that have the title of anatomy. The most famous is probably Robert Burton's 17th century tome, The Anatomy of Melancholy, a wonderfully philosophical, quasi-scientific look at sorrow and depression and sadness. There's The Anatomy of Wit, right? And Shakespeare himself, throughout the course of his plays, he appropriates the word anatomy, takes it right from the anatomical theaters right down the street from him, and puts them into his plays as a philosophical instance of exposing corruption, of bringing, so that's what dissection does. It brings to light what's hidden beneath. It takes what's hidden beneath by flesh and bone and skin and reveals it for all to see. You can see how that would become, in short order, a wonderful metaphor for a philosophical, satirical way of exposing corruption. And so in the play As You Like It, a comedy, one of Shakespeare's great comedies, we have the character of Jaques, as the English would have pronounced him. And he's a philosopher. He's a sarcastic fool in many regards. He's a jester. Jaques has a tremendous wit. He likes to riposte with people. He's constantly observing nature and dissecting it. He's dissecting human mores. And so you get this great speech in As You Like It, in which the character Jaques describes what it is that he does. As a fool, he says, I, the fool, the truth teller, I must have liberty, as large a charter as the wind to blow on whom I please, for so fools have. I mean, if you're a fool in Shakespeare's England, right, all great kings, King Lear, they had the fool, these jesters, whose job it was to tell the king very serious truths, but to tell them in such silly, foolish ways that the fool didn't get his head off. It's a dangerous job. If you're a king's fool, it's a dangerous job. You tell the king the truth, but you have to do it without offending him. You remind the king that he's mortal and oftentimes foolish and stupid, but you have to do it in such a way that you keep your own head. And that's what Jacques is explaining. If I'm going to be a fool, he says, you have to give me freedom of speech. I must have liberty. As large a charter as the wind, I must be able to blow on whom I please. However high ranked you are in society, that's what fools have. And those people out there that are most upset with me, most galled with my folly, they most must laugh. The higher placed you are in society, the more important a person you are, the fool says, the more you must laugh when I zing you. And why, sir, must they so? The why is as plain as the way to parish church. He that a fool doth very wisely hit, doth very foolishly, although he's smart, not to seem senseless of the bob. So if a fool calls you out for your folly, you better laugh. Because if you get mad at the fool for calling out your folly, then you look even more silly, right? That you're fighting against the justifiable criticisms of the fool. He that a fool doth very wisely hit with his sarcasm, that person does very foolishly, although he stings, not to seem senseless of the bob. If you're one of those high-placed, important men who, when the fool zings you, if you get angry, then the wise man's folly is anatomized, even by the squandering glances of the fool. The job of the fool in Shakespeare's England was to cut open the body politic, cut into society, yank it open so that you could see what was rotten inside it. It was satire. If you don't take this the right way, he says, the wise man's folly is anatomized even by the squandering glances of the fool. Invest me in my motley, give me my fool's clothing, and give me leave to speak my mind. And if you do that, the fool says, I will through and through cleanse the foul body of the infected world, if they will patiently receive my medicine. If you allow me to freely speak about the corruption in our society, I will cleanse it, right? That's a big, tall order. And you can see how what was happening in the dissection theaters and what was happening in the dissection stages and what was happening on the Elizabethan stages with the poetry, right? How it all begins to roll. How the science was impacting the philosophy, how the philosophy was impacting the theater, how the poets themselves began to become anatomists, satirists, whose job it was to metaphorically take the body politic, open it, and expose it to view, what was inside, to heal it. And you see how these things go back and forth. And we talked about how after all this death, from the public executions, the culture of dissection, all of the plagues and diseases and infant mortalities that Shakespeare's world had to deal with, they still, as we've seen time and time again, they still kept faith. They still kept to the idea, held to it dearly, that death, however miserable, death, however inevitable, death, however ubiquitous, still was but a doorway to something better. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning. For those unlike Macbeth who had chosen wisely, for those who stayed close to God, did not despair, avoided the hangman's gallows, the anatomist's table, we had reason to hope in Christ Jesus that there would be something big beyond it. And so those last four plays, again, Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest, modern-day fairy tales, they get beyond death. Take this beautiful song sung in the play Cymbeline. It's wonderful. It's really wonderful when set to music, but man, what a remarkable ability the human mind has to take tragedy, even something as tragic for humanity in general as death and decay, and to put it to such beautiful song, to put it to such beautiful foil in this music. Fear no more the heat of this, obviously speaking about death, right? Fear no more the heat of the sun, nor the furious winter's rages. Thou thy worldly task hast done. Home art gone, and taken thy wages. Golden lads and girls all must, as chimney sweepers come to dust. What a beautiful line. You know, Notice how there's no sense of loss, there's no sense of fear here. When you finally pass out of this life, it's not a bad thing. Fear no more the heat of the sun, nor the furious winter's rages. Thou thy worldly task hast done. You're gone home now, and you're getting your wages. It's true. Golden lads and pretty girls all must, just like chimney sweepers, come to dust. Fear no more the frown of the great. Thou art past the tyrant's stroke. Care no more to clothe and eat. To thee the reed is as the oak. The scepter, learning physic must. I'll follow this and come to dust. Power of the king, the brilliance of the scholar, the healing skill of the doctor, they all too will follow this and come to dust. The last part of the song. Fear no more the lightning flash, nor the all-dread thunderstone. Fear not slander, censure rash. You have finished now with joy and moan. All lovers young, all lovers must consign to thee and come to dust. And then it ends with this beautiful benediction. May no exorciser harm thee, nor no witchcraft charm thee. Ghost unlaid forbear thee, nothing ill come near thee. Quiet consummation have, and renowned be thy grave. Let no exorcism be required. Keep the witches and the ghosts from you. May nothing ill betide you in your grave. May you have a quiet consummation with the dirt that gave rise to you, and forever remembered be thy grave. Again, 400 years from the death of Shakespeare, and that's exactly what we have here. A grave forever remembered, a body undisturbed, a poetic genius that continues to live on. One of my favorite plays is Shakespeare's more or less his last play. It's a play called The Tempest. And it's all about, it begins with a kind of dying. In the very first act and scene of The Tempest, you see, right as soon as the theater lights come on, there's a ship at sea, and as far as you can tell, it sinks. And all the souls on it seem to go under. In other words, the very first thing you see in The Tempest is evidently the end of the play. You watch the whole crew go under. Turns out, though, that all of this is done by magic. And all of the creatures, all the living human beings on the boat are magically brought to this island in the middle of the Mediterranean, this undiscovered island. And there, they are rewarded or punished based on how they live their lives. This island in the middle of the Mediterranean to which these human beings are brought, it becomes a heaven for the good, and it becomes a kind of a hell for the bad. And the wizard in charge of the island is a fellow by the name of Prospero. He's this mighty magician who brings his enemies and his friends to the island to reward those who protected him and to punish those who banished him to this island all those years ago. And in the final scene, one of the final scenes in the play, Prospero, and this is really fascinating, we know that Shakespeare didn't just write plays, he also acted in them. There are a few roles that we know he probably played. We are pretty sure that Shakespeare played the role of Prospero. There seems to be evidence that he himself would have played this part. And so there's this great scene at the end of the play where all of that death that seemed to occur in the first act of the play, everybody's come back to life. Everybody's been brought beyond death on the ocean to the island where they live again, and they are rewarded or punished based on their behavior. And at the end of it, all the characters, even the wicked ones, are brought to a kind of accord. Prospero, of course, in this instance, is a kind of God figure who has the power to judge the lives of these men and women. And you get this wonderfully beautiful speech at the end where Prospero reflects on not just what life is and not just what happens when we die, but more than that, how life itself gives way to something greater. It's one of the famous speeches of Shakespeare. He's talking to his future son-in-law Ferdinand, and he says, "You do look, my son, in a moved sort, as if you were dismayed. Be cheerful, sir. Our revels now are ended. These, our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, The cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, all shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. What does it mean to be human? We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Prospero says those words after the little play he puts on for his daughter and son-in-law. After that vanishes into air, the actors melt away. Yet another really wonderful comparison between our life on this earth and a stage play. I love what he says there, the great globe itself. That's a pun, isn't it? Shakespeare's theater was named the Globe. Over and over again, Shakespeare compares life to a stage. You may remember from As You Like It, the famous pronouncement that all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely actors. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. And then you get the breakdown of the 7 ages of man, from the mewling schoolboy, right, all the way up till the old man who's dead. You go back to the Tempest passage here, you get that beautiful image of the theater again. It's a gorgeous image, right? If you've ever gone to the theater, it's very different than watching a movie. If you've ever gone to see live theater, there's something really magical about it. When the lights go out, and then all of a sudden the stage is illuminated, and you have real people in real time acting, speaking, taking on a part, it's much different than the movies. If you've ever had that experience in the theater, and then when the play's over, and the lights come up, and you see the wires hanging from the top where characters flew, and you see the nails in the wooden scenery, the illusion of the theater is broken. It gives way to something more lasting. That's very much the image that Shakespeare has here in this quote from Prospero. In a way, you could argue that all of our friends, everybody we know, we're all just actors in this great stage play. The director is God. We all play our parts. Some of us are blessed with longer parts, others shorter. Some come, some go. Some end up taking major roles on the scene of this world. Others recede into the background as bit players and extras. These are actors. As I told you, Prospero says, ultimately we are all but spirits, and one day we too will melt into air, thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, it's just an illusion. Reality, God, heaven's reality, this is just illusion, this world. All of it will, including the great globe itself, will dissolve. And like this insubstantial pageant faded, the whole world will dissolve one day and leave nothing behind. To be human is to be the very stuff his dreams are made on. And it's those dreams, those human visions, ambitions, desires, acts of faith and worship, that's what's going to live on long after the human body is gone. We are such stuff as dreams are made on. And our little life is rounded with a sleep. Right? These plays that move forward. We know that Prospero, the character Prospero, at the very end of the Tempest, he gives the epilogue. And imagine this. Prospero saying goodbye to his magic, which is a euphemism for Shakespeare's art, right? The guy who played Prospero, most likely Shakespeare, at the end of arguably the last play he ever wrote, steps forward, and there's Shakespeare, the great dramatic artist. And it's not just Prospero saying goodbye to his magic powers and going back to Italy with his family. It's also Shakespeare saying his goodbye to the theater, walking away with 3 years left before he died to go become a gentleman farmer in Stratford. And all the wonderful illusions of life that Shakespeare had left us with. Here's actually the epilogue he speaks at the end of the play. And these may be words not just that Shakespeare wrote, but that Shakespeare, the actor portraying Prospero, said. And he's talking to the audience. And when he talks about his charms, he means his art, his power to charm people in the theater. Now, he says, my charms are all overthrown. And it's me, you see. No more stage makeup, no more Lear or Othello, and what strength I have is my own, which is most faint. Maybe he was sick. Maybe that's why he retired to Stratford. Now my charms are all overthrown, and what strength I have is mine own, which is most faint. Now it is true. I must be here confined by you, or sent back to Naples. Let me not, since I have my dukedom got and pardoned the deceiver, dwell in this bare island by your spell, but release me from my bands, with the help of your good hands. What he calls for, Shakespeare, is to be freed from the dramatic world he's created. Let me go home. One more time, Shakespeare says, if I have pleased you, applaud. Release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. Without your acclaim, without your good words, without your cheers, I can go nowhere. Gentle breath of yours, my sails must fill. Or else my whole project fails, Shakespeare says, which was simply to please you. Now you see me for the man I am. No Puck, no Caesar, no Antony, right? You see me as the playwright. Now I lack spirits to enforce art. I've given up my art, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer. Your prayer, your hands clapping, your voice screaming. One more time. Unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardon be, let your indulgence set me free. Let me leave you now. Let me leave the theater. Let me go back to Stratford and contemplate my own death. Let me now put aside the beauty, the majesty, the world-creating power of my art and go back and be a man. That's a remarkable way to end your career. We'll close with this very quickly. That's John Donne, the great poet of Shakespeare's contemporary poet, one of the great poets of the English language. In some ways, a very different poet from Shakespeare, but in his own way, equally beautiful. Donne, of course, has given us many, many great poems about death. In fact, when Donne was an old man in 1632, with months left to live, he too began to think of his mortality. He was sick. And so he called an artist to come to his house. And Donne stripped off his clothes, put on a shroud, had the shroud tied at the top there. If you look at the image, you can see he's wearing a winding sheet. He's still alive, he's still healthy, but he had himself dressed from top to toe in a burial shroud, what they used to bury them in, a winding sheet, tied at the top, tied at the feet, his arms bound across his chest. He had an artist sketch him the way he would look in his coffin. And he took the picture and he nailed it above his bed. And every morning when he got up, and every night before he went to bed, Donne looked at his own death mask, his own death picture. It has since been turned into a sculpture, a three-dimensional sculpture. There's the living John Donne in his burial shroud. John Donne is the same poet who wrote so powerfully about death. This is the epilogue for our chorus. Death, be not proud. Though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, you have nothing to brag about, death. Do not be proud, death, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thy overthrow, death, they don't die, nor yet can you kill me. Think about that beautiful image. I believe in Jesus Christ, Donne said. Death, you can't kill me. You can just send me to him, where I will live again. Thou thinkest that thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death. And if you look at death that way, death isn't the end. Death is the beginning of eternity. In that sense, death, I pity you. Those that thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet can thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, death, comes much pleasure. When we close our eyes and rest or sleep, we derive much pleasure. Then how much more must flow pleasure, death? And soon, if from you, and soonest our best men do with thee go. You know the old line, right? That only the good die young? The sooner our best men go with thee. And what do they find? In death, rest for their bones and the soul's delivery. Death, you are a slave to fate, to chance, to kings, to desperate men. Any desperate man can kill himself and invoke death, boss death around. Kings can execute men, all right? You aren't in charge. Chance, fate. You have no control over anything, death. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. And you with poison, war, and sickness dwell. Who are your companions, death, poison, war, and sickness? And by the way, opiates, poppy, and medicine can make us sleep every bit as well as you can, death, and even better than thy stroke. And so, Why do you swell then, death? What are you proud of? Don't you know that one short sleep of death passed, and we wake eternally, and death shall be no more? Death, you are the only thing in the universe that will ultimately die. Every living thing lives on. But you, death, are the only thing when Christ comes again that officially goes away. Thank you for being with us. Appreciate it very much. And we'll have more for you coming. We'll have new programs in the future, so keep your eye out for them. We'll let you know what they're going to be. Thanks to all who joined us today.